All right, so for our first Bible lesson, guys, there's really no scripture text that we can read that we're going to talk about. On that paper that you just filled out, how many years were there between the Old Testament and the New Testament? Okay, you find some Garrett.
400.
Most scholars 400 years, okay, between those two, Malachi and Matthew. Okay, you kind of call it a period of darkness. Okay, now at the end of the Old Testament, where we left off at the end of last year, and we kind of talked about that chapel. What were the Israelites doing? What had they done? What was going on? What had happened to them, Jen?
They just returned from captivity.
Okay, they returned from Babylon. So that means who was the world power? It's a little bit of a trick question. Faith?
Babylon.
You can say Babylon, but who came after Babylon? Remember Nebuchadnezzar's dream of all the different parts in the image, right? Babylon was the gold. And who was after the shoulders, Emma? All right, the Medes and Persians came next. So they were actually in charge when the Israelites went back. Okay? And so they went back, and the Medes and Persians were in control. So Jerusalem was rebuilt. The walls we saw under Nehemiah were rebuilt. The temple was rebuilt. And then, if you remember, in that image, do you remember what nation was going to come next? That was going to be a world power. Who's going to be the next world power? Joe? No, before the Romans. They will be a world power, but it's before them. Jesse?
Greek.
Yeah, the Greeks. So during that 400 years is when the Greeks are ruling. And that is a very important group of people that God wanted them to come in control. Okay, we'll talk about that a little bit more, but what language would the people be speaking then? If the Greeks become the world power, what language are the people going to read and write in? Faith?
Greek.
Okay, they're going to write in the Greek language, and that's actually what the Old Testament will be translated into, called the Septuagint. Okay, it's going to be in the Greek language. Now, who comes after? Who said that? Who said the Romans? Job, right? So they are going to start coming in power right around the time that Matthew starts, or a little bit before Christ is born. The Romans are going to come so that Caesar Augustus can make his decree, right, that all the world should be taxed. And the people, so that's going on in this time period too. So anyways, we saw the two groups return. Okay, the last prophet is the last book of the Old Testament. So who's the last prophet, Kimberly?
Malachi.
Okay, it was Malachi. And we don't hear anything for those 400 years. We call it a period of darkness. Other historians, God's Word doesn't tell us, but how do we know what's going on? Grant? How do we know that? What happened in those 400 years? Well, we do, just not from the Bible. We could guess, but that won't be very good. We want to be accurate. So where else can we figure out? Where else can we figure out this stuff? Micah, how can we find out what was happening during those 400 years? So Micah, you got to do a report on tell me what happened in between the 400 years. What would you do? How would you start your report? Emma, what would you go do? What do we call that? I said you got to do a report on 400 years between. What would you do? What's that word called? Garrett? Yeah, you go do some research, right? You'd look it up. You'd go on the internet or you'd go find some books and do some research. That's how we know what happened in 400 years. Wise scholars have done research. They've gone back, and the Greeks were writing things down, so they would go back to the writings of the Greeks, and the Greeks were writing down history. We know Alexandria, they had one of the world's largest libraries in Egypt. So lots of people were writing things down by this time. So we're able to go back to see what they're writing down. Okay? So the Medes and Persians ruled at the beginning of the 400 years. We know that the priests become corrupted because by the time Christ is born, what are they doing in the temple? What did Christ have to do when he got there one day? Garrett? Buying and selling. So we see the priesthood is being corrupted. What group of people are the leaders in Jerusalem who are a very corrupt group of people who are changing the way that the people should be living? What groups are in charge of in Jerusalem? Garrett.
Pharisees and Sadducees.
Pharisees and Sadducees. Garrett's doing so much volunteering. All right, so the Pharisees and Sadducees, they're in charge. Okay, we know, and we'll see how they're a group that Christ has to very much teach them and try to teach them how wrong they are. So they are in the ruling, and they are not teaching the people properly. So they are there. Alexander the Great was one of the great Greeks. Okay, and Israel, the land of Israel, was under his control. But when he tried to battle the Egyptians, it was always seems to be in history a bad idea to go to battle with the Egyptians. He lost, and so Israel then kind of became a little bit more under control over the Egyptians, that area. So gone are they from their, and that was a time when the Greeks are becoming weaker and weaker. Next, the Romans will come. They will take back over the land of Jerusalem. Okay. So the language, again, that's a major change. Was the Old Testament was translated into Greek. We called it the Septuagint, and we see that the Romans are going to begin to take over control. A man named Antiochus Epiphanes was a type of ruler that came out of that area with the Syrians. And now, when we start with studying John the Baptist coming and Jesus Christ being born, Logan, what group of people is going to be in control? The Roman group. Okay, so that exactly how God declared in the Old Testament where Christ would be born, God would use Caesar Augustus to make that decree so that Christ had to be born in Bethlehem. Joseph and Mary would have to go there because of hometown. So God is in control of all of these things. We can see that, right? And that's the same thing that you can know today. God's in control of everything in your life, right? So the job that your mom and dad have, the number of brothers and sisters that you have, what you're going to do after school, if somebody becomes sick in your family and dies, okay? All of those things are under God's control. And we don't always see the goodness of that plan. We don't always understand why God's plan is good. But we can look back at history and we can say, hey, God was using these wicked people to do these things, and it was for the good of Christ. So maybe there's things happening in our country today that we don't understand, laws and changes, but they're happening for our good, just like we see back then. All right. So we've got here, I asked some questions. What was God doing in his creation during those years of darkness between the Old Testament and New Testament? You guys all answered this, or most of you answered it. What'd you put down here? What was God, what do you think? It's okay to have a wrong answer. I want to know what you're thinking. Faith, what'd you put?
Nothing.
He wasn't doing anything. God was taking a break. He was sitting back. He had no plan. Well, not nothing. Well, let's help. I saw a few nothings in here. So this is something that will be good for us to think about. This is a good question to ask, because we should contemplate what's going on there. Jesse?
Preparing the world for Christ.
Okay. God is preparing the world for Christ. And what are some ways that we talked about that today? Emma, what's one way? Here, if you can hang on to that.
Bringing the Greeks into power.
Okay. Bringing the Greeks into power. And then later the Romans. Okay. How else was God preparing, or what else was God doing at that time? What was something else that we said today? Megan? What else did we say today that God was maybe doing during that time? Languages, translation, what was going on? Really?
The Old Testament was translated into Greek.
Okay. How many different writers? I don't know the answer to this. I just want you to think about it too. How many writers of the Old Testament were there? 25, 30. We know Moses wrote the first 5 books, right? Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. And then we know David's got Psalms. Solomon's got Proverbs, Song of Solomon. Okay. So we know there's different men who wrote it. Well, what language would they probably have written it in?
Hebrew.
Probably in Hebrew, okay? And so God is taking, and maybe even in our history we see languages change. Okay? The 7th and 8th graders, you guys, when we went to that rare book place, right, we stopped there, he was reading some of the old English, and the language is very different than the language today. Okay? We wouldn't be able to understand half of what they're saying. So maybe from Moses until Malachi, maybe there were some changes in the languages. Anyways, this unified everything to be written into the Greek. So it was very easy now for God to spread the gospel. Okay, now, because the whole Greek Empire, probably there are men and women living everywhere who speak Greek, God can spread his word. So God is doing a lot of work during those 4, even though he didn't record anything in the scriptures, things are being done. He's preparing. Okay? All right, and then, so this is more of an opinion. Why didn't God? Why doesn't God tell us? I mean, for 4 years, there's just a big blank spot. Why didn't God tell us anything in that 400 years? Why do you think? It's just an opinion. I don't have a right or wrong answer. Emma?
There are no prophets to write it down.
There are no prophets to write it down. Maybe there are no godly people, good leaders. That's a great answer. Why else? Anybody? Jesse? What'd you put there?
He didn't want us to know.
Yeah, maybe there's a reason for us to know anything. Maybe there's nothing important that happened. That would be another good one. Okay? Yep. See some other ones along those same lines. There's no prophet. Okay, maybe he doesn't want us to know. Okay. Very good. So anyways, that's the 400 years that we just don't know anything about. Okay? And it's called that's a big long word there, Intertestamentary period. Right? Between the two, the Old Testament and the New Testament. So tomorrow what we'll do is, or tonight or this afternoon or whenever, you'll look at lesson 2. It'll look a lot the same. Fill out some of the questions. There's just a little bit for contemplation. If there are Bible texts that help you find the answer, okay, I put those on there. You might have to do a little bit of thinking. Okay, kind of like doing some of your notes for catechism, okay, Sunday school, or you might have to look a few things up. So fill that out, and then you can either email it to me. That would be the preferable way. Just email it to me, and then I'll be able to see that you did it, and I'll give you credit for doing that. Okay? All right. So that's lesson 1. You guys can take your chairs back and we'll do a little